In this video, you'll learn exactly how to use OpenAI's Whisper and Bubble to create your own speech-to-text feature. In our example today, we'll build an app that allows a user to record an audio file, then have OpenAI transcribe that into text. This feature is perfect if you're looking to transcribe things like meetings or calls, or even if you just want to build your very own AI-powered note-taking tool. Now, if you don't have any coding experience, please do not stress. You don't need to know how to code for this video. I'll be holding your hand throughout the entire process as I walk you through the step-by-step instructions you need to follow. Look, by this point, I've already said enough. Let's just dive right into it and we can get started. When it comes to our tutorial today, the first thing I wanted to do before I jump into any of the settings or configurations is just show you a demo of exactly what we're going to build. Now look, there's so many use cases that you can leverage the OpenAI API for, but today I'm just going to show you one small example. So what I've done is I've just created a quick page inside of my Bubble editor, and I'm running a preview of this now. And on this page, you'll see a button here where I can start recording an audio note. So I'm going to select this button and then I'm going to talk into my microphone. I'm going to say, today I'll be teaching you how to use the OpenAI Whisper API. It's really cool and it's super exciting. I'm then going to stop that recording. It's going to then create an audio entry in my database. So as you can see, we have an audio file here that was recorded at this particular time on this particular day. And if you wanted, you could play that back over. But what I'm interested in doing is transcribing this into text. So this is where we're going to leverage the API from OpenAPI. So when I click this button here, it's going to send that audio file right over to OpenAI. It's going to transcribe it and it's going to return the exact text that I had spoken. So if you're trying to build an app where you need to transcribe audio, perhaps it's something like transcribing meeting notes, this is the tutorial you need to watch. So let's jump over into my checklist and walk over everything that I'm going to cover today. So the first thing I wanted to do was show you a demo of my product. And then from here, you'll see there's a long list of items that we need to cover. And look, if you were interested in using this same checklist to follow along so we can tick items off as we walk through this tutorial, I'll be sure to share a link to this checklist in the description of this video. I just use a tool called Notion. I think it's great because you can tick items off. And as you'll see, the very first thing we need to do at the top of my list is obviously build out the connection to the OpenAI API. Now, if you're relatively new to Bubble and you're not familiar with APIs, please don't stress. If this dummy here can handle APIs, you will be able to as well. If I can be completely transparent, APIs used to scare the absolute hell out of me when I first started using Bubble. But thankfully, the OpenAI platform has a super straightforward API to integrate with. And if in doubt, you can always use a tool like ChatGPT to help you throughout that process. But look, you won't need to today because it is my job to explain everything you need to know in as much detail as I can. So what we're going to do is we're going to head over to our Bubble editor here. We're then going to jump over to our plugins tab. And at this point in time, I've already set everything up. But what I want to do today is remove everything so that way I can walk you through the exact steps you need to know. So I'm just going to delete this existing API that I've already created. And before we even get to this point, you will need to install the free API connector plugin, which is built by Bubble. So you'll just need to open up your plugins library here, type in the word API, and you'll install this plugin, which is the API connector. As I mentioned, it's a free plugin and it's built by Bubble. Then once you've done that, we can select done, and this is where things are going to get interesting. What we'll need to do is select to add a new API within our Bubble app. And when it comes to this API, we're just going to follow the instructions laid out within the documentation that OpenAI provides. So within my checklist, I've added a link to a documentation page for the specific API we're going to use today, which is the speech-to-text API, or also known as OpenAI Whisper, as you can see here. Now, I'm just going to close a couple of my tabs here, because if we scroll on down, you're going to see the quick start option here for the transcriptions API, which is exactly what we want to work with. Now, just a personal preference of mine, if you're viewing this API, you can choose to view this as a curl or in Python. Now, in my opinion, it's easier to work with a curl. And look, there are other benefits like being able to import this curl directly into Bubble. But today, I'm going to show you how we can do this step by step from scratch. So essentially what we need to do is move all of this information over into our Bubble app so we can easily start to communicate with OpenAI. So back in our Bubble editor, we're going to create our very first API, and I'm going to call this OpenAPI because this is the service that we're connecting to. Now, when you're creating APIs, the name you add here is going to be the name of the actual service you're connecting to, not the name of this specific API. So a little further down, you can see that you can name an API call. In this case of our tutorial today, this is where we would call that the Whisper API or the speech to text API. But for the main API, so this is the name of the overall service we're connecting to, that is of course going to be OpenAI. Now for this API, Bubble needs to recognize where it should connect to. So we need to create what's known as an authentication. And today we're going to select the option known as private key in header. And how do I know to select this option? Well, in 90% of scenarios, whenever you're working with APIs, this is the way you will authenticate them. So it's a bit of a standard practice within the industry. But what I can also see over in our documentation is these parameters known as header. So this is where OpenAI wants us to connect an authorization using our API key. And look, if you're brand new to Bubble, I completely understand if everything I just said sounded like complete jargon. Essentially, if we have two services, so Bubble here and OpenAI, these two just need to be able to speak to each other. So by using what's known as an API key, it creates a direct line of communication between these two platforms. So the term key is kind of like opening a door so that these two services can see each other and talk to each other. Now what you might notice is that within our first header here, we have this parameter known as authorization. And back in our Bubble editor, it's automatically added the exact same word as a key. So if the key name is called authorization, which it has automatically added from the OpenAI call, for the value, what we need to do is add in our API key. Now, if you've created a brand new OpenAI account and you don't yet have an API key, it's a pretty straightforward process to creating one yourself. All you need to do is head over to your API keys tab. I'm going to open this up in a new tab here. And then you'll need to create a secret key. Then from here, you'll need to copy across that secret key because we're about to add it into our Bubble app. So back in Bubble here, for our key value, before we paste in this field, what we need to do is actually add a little bit of text before that. Because over in the documentation, you can see that our token here, which is known as our API key, right before that, it has the word bearer followed by a space. Now, once again, adding the word bearer before an API key is a pretty standard industry practice. It just means that you're the person who bears the API key. So you're the owner of it. So what we're going to do is type in the word bearer with a capital B and then a space. And then from here, you're going to paste in your secret key. So I'm going to paste my key in, and that is all we'll need to change for this point in time. Now, what this means by adding my authorization key on the overall API is that for every single API call I create, I don't need to reauthorize it. It's going to use the universal authorization that we've just created here. Because in the one service of OpenAI, there's plenty of different API calls you could reference. There's things like text generation, image generation, the speech to text, text to speech, and so on. So if you didn't add this authorization key at the top level, you would essentially need to have to create it for every single individual API call that you add in. Now, the other thing you may have noticed is that in my documentation, there was another key here, or header key, I should say, known as the content type. Now, you could theoretically add this at the top level for your API, but I personally like to re-add that one on every single API call. Just because when it comes to the content type of each API call you use, it's going to be different. So if you're working with images, you might need to leverage files, whereas if you're working with text generation, you're going to need to use text. So the content format will be different for every single use case. So instead of adding that as a universal content type on the overall API, I like to add that on every single individual API call. And so that's exactly what we're going to do. We're now going to create our very first API call, which will allow us to send some data through to OpenAI and have it return some information. So in our use case today, we're going to send it an audio file and it's going to return text. So what we're going to do is create a brand new API call here. And I'm just going to choose to expand this out. And I'm going to call this the Whisper and then in brackets, speech to text. Now, you can call this whatever you like, it doesn't matter, but this is just the naming convention I'm going to use today. Now from here, we need to make a few minor tweaks. So for this particular API call, the first thing I'll need to update is the way we're going to use this. So when it comes to API calls, you can either receive data from a service or you can send data to a service. So if you're receiving data from a service, it's known as the data option. Whereas if you're sending data to a service, it's known as an action. And so obviously in this case today, what I'd like to do is send some data to OpenAI. and that data is going to be an audio file that we record. Then for the next field, which is the data type, we're just going to leave that as JSON. But below this, you'll see an input field, which is very important. This is where we need to add the address for this API service. And if we jump back over to our OpenAI documentation, you'll see right at the top here, there's a URL. What we need to do is highlight this, make a copy, jump back into Bubble and paste this in. So what this URL does is it essentially just tells Bubble where this API lives on the internet. So it's kind of like the postal address or the home address. And so what we want to do today is essentially write a letter and post it to that address. And inside that letter is going to be an audio file. And we're going to say, hey, when you receive this, can you please turn this audio into text? And it will then return a letter with all of that text. But of course, in the back end, it's going to be a whole lot more technical than that. But that then leads me into my next point. We just need to update the way we're going to work with this API. So we're not going to get data from this API. Instead, what we're going to do is post data to this API. And that data we'll be posting is, of course, that audio file. And this is all we'll need to change for this little top section. But if we move down, you'll see the option to add in a header. Now, this is what I was referring to before when I mentioned that you could add specific header values for each individual API call. So over in our documentation, there was the header value known as the content type. Instead of adding that on the overall API itself, what we're going to do is now add this to our individual API call. So we're just going to copy this exact text here. So this is content type without the semicolon. I'm just going to make a copy, jump back into Bubble and add a new header. And I'm going to paste that in as the header key. Then for the value, we just need to jump back into the documentation and copy across the value that's provided. So this is the multi-part / form data. We'll jump back in, paste that into that field there. It was super easy, but we also just need to uncheck this option to make this private, which is just going to make it easier to access. And this is the only header value we'll need to add on this specific API call, because of course we've already added the authorization header to the overall API. So we have now included both, but one was just more specific to this exact API call. The next thing we'll need to do is just update the body type. Now, as you can see, OpenAI just mentions that this needs to be multi-part or form data. So that's exactly what we're going to select here. For the body type, it will be form data. And then finally, we just need to add in our parameters. Now, parameters are just essentially a fancy way of saying what information we're going to send through with this API call. And there's going to be 2 bits of information, and OpenAI actually lays these out for us. So you can see below our header values, there's these 2 lines of text known as form. These are essentially our parameters. So the first thing OpenAI needs in order to transcribe an audio file is in fact an audio file. So we need to send through the link of where that audio file lives on the internet. So we can search for it, it can listen to it, and then it can transcribe it for us. So the name of this parameter is just going to be called file. So if we jump back into Bubble, we're going to add a parameter here and we're going to call this file. It's super straightforward. But if you've ever worked with an API in Bubble, or in fact, if you are brand new to working with APIs in Bubble, one thing you should note is that you do need to add a sample value before you can configure this API. Just so that way, when you run a preview of this, it has some information to use within a demo. And so if we're sending through an audio file, I now need to create one. So if you've got something like an MP3 on your device, you can upload this. But if you don't, what you can do is record a quick audio file. So for instance, I'm currently using a Mac. So what I'm going to do is open up my voice memos here, and I'm going to choose to create a quick audio recording. I'm going to say something like, hello YouTube. Today I'm going to teach you how to integrate the OpenAI Whisper API with Bubble's no-code tool. I can then choose that this is done, and I'm then just going to drag this out onto my desktop, so that way it stores it as an actual audio file. Now, in order to upload my audio file that I've just created, what I need to do is tick this option here to say that I am sending a file, from which, if you hover over this text where it says upload, you can now choose to upload that file from your local device. And as you can see, that has uploaded there. I'm also going to uncheck this option to make this private. So once again, it doesn't have any issues sending that data through. And there is just one last parameter I need to add, which as you'll see here, it's the model that we need to reference. So when we send our API call through to OpenAI, we just need to tell it which specific model we want to use. And in this case, the model is Whisper 1. So obviously in the future, as they release new updates, you might want to leverage Whisper 2, 3, 4, and who knows where we'll get, maybe 99. But for today, what we're going to do is just highlight this value here known as Whisper 1, copy that, jump back over into Bubble, add a new parameter, and we're going to call this the model, spelt in all lowercase letters. For the value of this, I'm going to paste in the specific model, which of course is Whisper-1. I will uncheck that should be private. And this is now the fun part. We are entirely finished everything we need to configure inside of this API. So we just need to double check that it's going to work. So we're going to click this button here and initialize that API call. And if your API has been successfully connected, what you should see is the return text that OpenAI Whisper has transcribed. So you can see here it says, "Hello YouTube. Today I'm going to teach you how to integrate with the OpenAI Whisper API," which is exactly what I said in my voice memo. Now, if for some reason Bubble returns and displays an error message to you saying that you don't have enough credit, what you'll need to do is just go into your OpenAI account under your usage tab and buy some credits. Now, they do give you a couple of free API calls, but if you are testing multiple APIs, you will need to put something like $5 or $10 on your account. But look, thankfully, the API calls are fairly cheap anyway. But that's just something that I wanted to point out. From here, though, I'm going to choose to save this API. And we are done. So what I'm going to do is collapse that. And we can now jump back over into our Notion checklist and just tick off that we've finished building out the API integration. So within that, we obviously installed the plugin. We read through the documentation. We created our API call. We made a couple of minor tweaks to the way we were storing that data. We then added in all of our parameters. I recorded and uploaded a test voice memo, and then we initialized the call. And of course, I told you to check your billing settings, because the last thing I want is for someone to comment on this video and say, "Hey, your tutorial didn't work," when in reality, you just needed to connect a credit card and put some money on your OpenAI account. Now look, from here, this is where the fun part actually starts. In my opinion, playing around with APIs isn't too sexy, but building workflows and interfaces in Bubble definitely is. So what I want to do is show you a preview of everything I've created within my Bubble app to build out that experience I showed you in the initial demo of this video. So let's jump back into Bubble and open up my design tab. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what I'd like to do is introduce you to the grand opening of Transcribify, my new SaaS that takes any voice notes or meeting notes for that matter, and just transcribes those into text. Now, this of course is just one small use case for transcribing audio. I'm sure you probably got your own app where you'd like to integrate this. But for now, I'm just going to quickly walk you through how I've set this up. And more importantly, I'm going to show you how to build out the workflows to connect with that API that we just created. So first of all, I just want to walk you through the elements on my page. I've obviously got some text headings here. I've got a button which displays the word start recording. And below this, I've just added in an audio recorder element. So this is a plugin I had to install. It's a free plugin built by Bubble. Over in my plugins tab, you can see I've got the audio recorder and visualizer plugin, which again is built by Bubble. It's entirely free. I've added this onto my page. And when this button is clicked, I've selected to start recording in this particular audio recorder. So if I quickly just select on this button here and open up the workflow, what you'll see is that I have two separate workflows. And so within my first workflow here, the green one, you'll see that I'm just starting my audio recorder. And so if I wanted to rebuild that from scratch, this is what it would look like. I would choose to run a workflow whenever an element is clicked. The element would be my start recording button. And when it comes to the workflow, I would just type in the word start, and I'm going to choose to start, stop a recorder. And I only have one audio recorder on my page, so it's automatically going to reference that element. But the thing about working with this audio recorder is that starting and stopping are the exact same action. So we just need to be really specific and help Bubble recognize when it needs to start it and when it needs to stop it. And so that's why what we need to do is add a condition on our workflow trigger. So we only want this audio recorder to start if it obviously isn't already recording something. So on my workflow trigger, I'm going to create a condition, and I'm only going to allow this to run when my audio recorder element, when its is recording status is currently no, meaning it is not recording and it should in fact start recording. Now, for the sake of my tutorial, I've also updated the workflow color to be green, because green means go, and we're going to start recording that audio. Now look, I'm going to delete that there because the next workflow I built out is where a little bit of the magic is going to start to happen. So I've created an exact replica of our first workflow, But when it comes to the condition, I've made this the inverse option. So when the audio recorder status is in fact yes, not no. And of course, this trigger is when the button is also clicked. What I'm going to do is choose to stop the audio recorder. That's fine. But from here, I'm then going to upload that audio file into my database. Now I should also show you how I've set up my database. It's super straightforward. Over in my data tab here, I have a data type known as audio recording. And inside of this data type, I have two fields. Number one, there's the audio file, and this is set as a file type. Then there's the transcription, which is set as text. So obviously at this point in time, I would have an audio file if I've just recorded something. So I need to create a new audio recording in my database and store that within the file. But right then and there, we wouldn't have the transcription. We obviously need to send that through to OpenAI in order for it to transcribe that file. Now, your data type might look completely different based on the app you're trying to build. You might be trying to transcribe meeting notes, so your data type might be something like a meeting, but you just need to make sure whatever you're trying to create and transcribe, you have these two fields here. I'm then going to jump back into my workflow tab because what I'd like to do is show you how we can build out the remaining steps of this workflow here. And in fact, what I should do is actually delete these steps so we can rebuild it from scratch. So after my audio recorder has been stopped, what I'll need to do is upload a version of that audio as a file. So if I type in the word upload, you'll see a workflow related to my audio recorder element known as upload content of a recorder. And once again, by default, I only have one recorder on my app, so that's why it's selected that already. Now, if you wanted, you could choose to customize this name with a dynamic value, but I'm just going to leave mine as the standard static file name here. But after this, once we've uploaded that piece of content, we need to store that in our database. So if we create another action, head to our data tab and choose to create a new thing, we can create a new audio recording from which I just want to be able to store the audio file. And that's going to be the result of step 2. That is literally all we need to change. Now from here, if we jump back into our design tab, at the bottom of my page, what I've done is I've just added a repeating group to display all of the audio recordings in my database. So for the type of content, I'm displaying a list of audio recordings. And for the data source, I'm just searching for all of the audio recording. So there's nothing too complex about this. But inside of my repeating group, what I've done is I've also added a standard group. So that way it can contain all of my elements that I need to display. So on the left-hand side here, I'm just displaying the date in which this particular audio recording was created. So in this case, it's just the parent group's audio recording, the creation date, and I've chosen to just format that as a time, and then I've got a dash, and then I'm adding the creation date once again, and I'm formatting that as a date. So that way it should just look like a timestamp followed by the date. Then beside this, I've added in an element which is an audio player. And to be completely honest, this is probably the most complex thing I'm about to show you inside of our demo today. I don't think connecting the API itself was too difficult to understand, but if you are brand new to Bubble and things like HTML and CSS scare the absolute hell out of you, this might seem a little daunting, but don't stress, I'm going to walk you through the process. So if you want to add an audio player, in theory, you could install a plugin to do that. There's plenty of great plugins that don't require any code or any HTML for that matter. But today I've just opted for a simpler choice in my opinion, which is just adding in a HTML audio player. Now, if you don't know how to add this, it's super straightforward, although it does look complex. I completely get that. In order to add this in, what you need to do is jump over to my Notion checklist. And what you'll see is I've added a checkpoint here known as creating a HTML audio player. And you'll see a link that I provided. So this site is great. It provides all of the HTML formatting you ever need. And all you have to do is swap the values out. So for this example here, we're just going to copy all of this HTML. We're then going to jump back into Bubble. Under our visual elements, we will add a HTML element inside of our repeating group. And then all we need to do is paste this HTML in and just replace the actual name of the file. So you can see in their example here, the file was called horse.ogg and horse.mp3. So all we need to do is just add in the URL of our audio recording. That's the only thing we need to change. We don't need to change anything else. So in order to do that, back in Bubble, we're just going to remove that text that's added in. And between our quotation marks, we're going to insert dynamic data and just reference the parent group's audio recording, the audio file, the URL of that. So that's where this particular audio file has been uploaded and where it lives on the internet. We'll then need to do the exact same thing for the source here. So for the horse.mp3, we're going to delete that. We're going to insert dynamic data, and once again reference the parent group's audio recording, the audio file, and the URL of where that file lives. And just like that, you will now have a fully functional audio player. Now, I personally try not to look at all that HTML because it definitely can seem overwhelming. But once again, in my opinion, it wasn't too difficult to add that in. I'm going to delete that though because I already have one in. But more importantly, what I'm interested in showing you right now is my feature that allows me to transcribe this audio recording. So within my group, you'll see I have a couple of hidden elements. There is a button and then there is a text element. So this button today is what's going to trigger the workflow that will send my audio file through to OpenAI and have this audio file transcribed. But something I should just point out is that when it comes to this button, under my layout tab, I have unselected that this should be visible on page load. So by default, it's not going to be shown. And the reason for that is because I only want this button to be shown when this text has not yet been transcribed. And the reason for that is because I only want this button to be displayed when our audio file has not yet been transcribed. If it has been transcribed, we obviously don't want someone to think that they could transcribe it again. That's pointless. So I've created a condition on this button that just recognizes when the parent group's audio recording, when the transcription field is in fact empty, meaning there's no value there, it hasn't been transcribed, this element should be visible. I've then done the exact same thing, but the inverse option for a text element below this. So for this text element, all I've done is I've added in the word transcription, and I chose to bold that text. So I just opened up my rich text editor, highlighted that, hit bold, and hit save. But of course, it's formatting that with the HTML there. And then below this, I've just added a space and added in the parent group's audio recording, the transcription field, which is just the text itself. Now, once again, by default, this text element is not visible on page load. However, I have created a condition that just recognizes when the parent group's audio recording, when its transcription text is not empty, meaning it has been transcribed, this element should be visible, and I've ticked that that should be true. And this then leads me to the very last and most important part of our tutorial, which is how we can build out the workflow that runs when our transcribe button is clicked. So if I edit my workflow, what you'll see is that I've already added a couple of steps here. And look, I'm happy to build these out from scratch again, so that way you can follow along. So within this workflow, we're gonna do two things. The first thing we're gonna do is send our audio file using our API call. So if we head to the plugins menu here, you'll see our API call, which is known as OpenAI Whisper Speech to Text. We'll click on this, and what you'll now see within this is the ability to send information using our parameters. So the first parameter is the file. We just need to reference which particular audio file we're going to be sending through to OpenAI. And in this case, it's going to be the audio file of the current cell that we've just hit transcribe on. But before we reference the URL of that audio file, we just need to make a minor tweak. So this is an example of what an audio file URL will look like. So you can see it's got the link, but something it doesn't have is the initial HTTPS at the start of the URL. So you can see it's got the 2 slashes that go behind that, but because this is in fact a proper URL, we need to add those in. So what we're gonna do is remove this static text, type in the letters HTTPS, semicolon, and then I'm gonna reference the audio file that I wanna transcribe. So what I'm gonna do is insert dynamic data, and I'm just gonna pull the parent group's audio recording, its actual audio file. Then for the next parameter, which is our model, this isn't going to change. It's just going to be Whisper1 because that is the OpenAI model that we need to send this data to. Then finally, once we've sent this information, OpenAI is going to return the end result, which is the transcription, and we just need to store that transcription in our database. So I'm going to add an additional step within our workflow. I'm going to head to our data tab. I'm going to choose to make changes to an existing thing. And in this case, the existing thing I'm going to change is the parent group's audio recording. And I just want to change the transcription. And I want it to be the result of step 1, where we had sent that to OpenAI, the text that it has returned. And that is everything we need to build out inside of this workflow. Now, one quick question that might be at the top of your mind is why on earth I didn't add these workflow steps within the workflow where we stopped a recording and created an audio file. In theory, you could, yes, add those 2 steps onto this workflow, so it all happens in one workflow. But something that's really important to know is the way in which Bubble runs an order of operations in a workflow. Although you are building out your workflow step by step, that's not actually how they run. When a workflow is triggered, it's pretty much a free-for-all. All these steps run at the exact same time, so they're not sequential. which means that if your audio file has not uploaded in time before you send your API call to OpenAI, you don't have an audio file to transcribe. So you're most likely going to get an error message. Now, of course, there are a couple of ways around this. You can use something like custom events, but I didn't want to have to spend another 20 minutes trying to describe to you what they are today. So what I've done is I've just broken this down into a completely separate workflow. But look, what I really want to do right now is just run another preview of this application so you can see everything we've just built come to life. Over in a preview of my application, I'm going to choose to start recording a new audio file, and I'm going to say something like, my name's Lachlan Kirkwood. I'm a simple man. I love the pleasures in life like OpenAI, Bubble, no code, and anything else in between. I'm then going to stop my recording. It's going to create that audio file entry in my database. Then if I scroll on down, I can see that I have a brand new audio recording here, but it has not yet been transcribed. So of course, what I need to do is transcribe this. So I'm going to click this button. It's going to run that workflow, send it to OpenAI, and as you can see, it has returned that value as text that we have now transcribed. So after we've ran a preview of that, what I'm going to do is jump back into my Notion checklist and just tick off that I finished building out all of the UI components for my app, all of the workflows that powered my experience, and of course, we ran a preview at the end there so we could see that experience come to life. And just like that, you now know how to integrate your Bubble app with OpenAI to create your very own speech-to-text feature. And as you can see, the entire process wasn't too complex. It's nothing that we couldn't handle. And we've truly only just scratched the surface of what's possible when it comes to the use cases for this particular model. If you wanted to stay up to date with any additional Bubble resources I share, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button on my channel so that way you can be the first to know whenever I drop a new video. For now though, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch this tutorial, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.